Greetings, how are you? I hope you're all well and looking forward to just a few more weeks of engagement with this class. So the introductory lecture for week 12, it's a short one, but I hope important to set up some context for the essay I'm asking you to read this week. The title of this section in the text is Practicing Theology, Engaging in Ministry. At the heart of nearly every essay in this text is this question: what does this have to do with real life? I hope by now that you're beginning to sense that the answer to this question is everything. Theological work and theological reflection have everything to do with all that we include under that rubric of engaging in ministry. If we're honest with ourselves, certainly if I'm honest with myself, in considering the ministry work that we're involved in, that I'm involved in, and ask the so what question, we might find ourselves struggling with why we do what we do and whether or not what we do or how we do it is meaningless. I do not mean that in the sense that the activity itself is meaningless. After all, the regular practice of communion cannot in itself be meaningless. But how we do it, why we do it, how we present it, how routinized it might be, and on, these can be meaningless activities and therefore may lead to less true engagement. They might lead people to wonder why we do the things we do and whether it really matters. Is it only because we've always done it? And that in itself is not a good enough question or good enough answer. Bass, in her introduction to the text, I remind you, says that to reflect theologically on practices is a demanding intellectual agenda, but it will not leave anyone asking, what does this have to do with real life? In this week's reading, we are confronted with one of the real challenges of our times. Actually, it's a challenge as old as time, but it seems to be majorly in our collective faces now. The question of the stranger. There can be little question that the extension of hospitality to the other, to the stranger, to the one who doesn't fit, is one of the central acts of the people of God. Jesus makes that clear in many ways, but perhaps most fundamentally in his inclusion of love your neighbor as an equal command in the great commandment to love God, and then follows that by clearly defining the neighbor as the one lying naked and beaten by the side of the Jericho road. Then, as if that's not clear enough, the picture he paints of the Last Judgment and how the goats and sheep are divided, well, it's pretty clear how Jesus thinks about the stranger. It is a challenge, and we could all spend the next 30 minutes listing all the reasons and examples and stories about just how dangerous it can be and how we are to go about loving our neighbor who is other than ourselves. It's a challenge. We all face it, sometimes in the immediacy of our actual next door neighbor, and sometimes in the neighbor that lives around the world. In this reading, we learn of two different Christian communities and the practices by which each encounters the stranger at the boundary of its collective body. One community is Anabaptist and the other is Afro-Baptist. You will read of how these two embodiments of the faith come to terms with the meaning of their beliefs and the practices that express those beliefs, struggling, as the author says, with the tension between self-preservation and the inherent risks we face as human beings and as Christians. I think there's no better way to end this brief introduction than to remind us first of what is currently going on in the land of Israel and Palestine, and of the tragedies that have occurred in churches, religious buildings, mosques, synagogues, churches across this country. Just for one, in an article in the Salt Lake Tribune dated several years ago, the author lists 14 separate shootings and murders that took place in the confines of churches and synagogues and mosques where people practiced their faith in 5 years. 14 separate shootings, not to count the people who were murdered or wounded during those times. These kinds of deaths invite us to consider, as the essay author does, how to maintain our faithful practice when those practices put us at risk. Bless you on the journey.